I was pulling the last of the green beans from the garden when my son called. It was a Tuesday, late September, the kind of afternoon where the light goes golden and slanted and everything feels like it's holding its breath before the cold comes. I had my basket over one arm and dirt on my knees, and I almost didn't hear the phone over the wind picking up through the back fence. "Mom," that was all he said. One word and I knew. My son, Elliot, has his father's voice, low and steady as river water. But right then it cracked somewhere in the middle of that single syllable, and I set the basket down on the porch steps and sat down next to it without even thinking. "What happened?" "It's Yvonne." A pause. "She's at St. Catherine's, Mom. They found her on Route 9 near the state forest. She was walking. She'd been—" He stopped, swallowed. "She wasn't wearing a coat. It was 41 degrees that morning. I was in my car before he finished the sentence. Yvonne came into our family 7 years ago like a quiet kind of sunshine." That sounds sentimental, I know. But that's the only way I can describe her. She didn't dazzle you. She just warmed you, slowly, until you realized one day that you'd been standing a little taller for months and you couldn't figure out why, and then you looked over and there she was. My son had been a closed-up, careful man since his father died, and Yvonne had opened him back up like a window in spring. She was 34, a physical therapist. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them and kept a little herb garden on the kitchen windowsill and remembered everyone's birthday without being reminded. She was 23 weeks pregnant with their first child. I drove 40 minutes to St. Catherine's with both hands locked on the wheel and the radio off. Elliot was in the waiting room when I got there, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He looked up when he heard my shoes on the linoleum, and I could see he'd been crying, which I had not seen my son do since the day we buried his father 11 years ago. "She's stable," he said immediately, because he knows me. "She's stable, Mom. The baby's okay." I sat down next to him and put my hand on his back and waited. It took him a while to get through it. The story kept breaking apart in his hands. Yvonne had gone to his mother's house that morning. His mother, her mother-in-law, had called the evening before and asked her to come by, said she wanted to talk about the baby shower, said she wanted to make peace. Yvonne had told Elliot about the call. He'd been cautious. His mother and Yvonne had never been warm toward each other, and lately it had gotten worse, a cold front that neither of them named directly. But Yvonne said she wanted to try. She was going to be a mother. She wanted things to be right. She drove out to his mother's house, Sylvia's house, early that morning around 8. By noon, nobody had heard from her. By 2 o'clock, a man driving home from a fishing trip on Route 9 saw a woman walking along the shoulder of the road, arms wrapped around herself, no coat, moving slowly. He pulled over. She could barely speak. The hospital found 2 cracked ribs, bruising across her left side, a gash on her forehead that had been clumsily wrapped with a dish towel. Mild hypothermia. The baby was still okay, but they were watching her closely. She hadn't been in any accident. There was no car. She had been left. I went in to see her after the doctors cleared it. Elliot came with me, and we stood on either side of her bed, and she looked so small under those white blankets. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles like bruises under her eyes, and that cut on her forehead had been properly dressed now, a square of white gauze taped just below her hairline. She looked at me when I came in, and something in her face just crumpled. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Don't you dare," I said. I took her hand. It was still cold. She told us what she could. She'd arrived at Sylvia's house, and Sylvia had been almost pleasant, which had surprised her. There was coffee made. They'd sat at the kitchen table. And then Sylvia's younger sister had arrived, a woman named Roberta, who Yvonne had met twice and never trusted, and the conversation had changed. Roberta had started talking about the family property, the land trust Elliot's grandfather had set up before he died, the acreage out near Franklin County that had been sitting idle for years. Sylvia wanted to sell it. Elliot had the controlling vote as the eldest grandchild, and he'd refused. Then Roberta had said it plainly, looking right at Yvonne, "The problem is you. You've turned him against his own family." Yvonne said she'd tried to leave. She'd stood up and picked up her purse and said she wasn't going to sit there for that. And that's when Sylvia had told her to sit back down. Her voice had changed. Something in it had hardened in a way Yvonne had never heard before. What happened next came out in pieces, slowly, with Yvonne's hand tightening around mine. Roberta had taken her car keys from her purse while she was distracted. Sylvia had told her that Elliot would sign the land trust documents, or Yvonne's name would be taken off the joint account they shared. Sylvia claimed to have documents, claimed she'd found things, said she had proof that Yvonne had been hiding money from the marriage. None of it was true. I knew that without asking. Yvonne had refused. She'd tried to call Elliot. Roberta had taken her phone, and then things had gotten physical. Yvonne didn't say it exactly that way. She said she pushed me, and I fell against the counter. And then she stopped and just looked down at her hands. I looked at my son. His jaw was set so tight I could see the muscle working in his cheek. They had put her in Roberta's car, told her she was going to calm down somewhere quiet, driven her out past the state forest, 40 minutes from town, past the point where the cell signal dies, and left her on the side of the road. Said she could walk back and think about whether she wanted to cooperate. 23 weeks pregnant, 41 degrees, no phone, no coat. Yvonne looked up at me from the hospital bed, and her voice was barely above a breath. She said Elliot would thank her eventually, that I didn't belong in this family, that the baby would be better off raised by real Caldwells.
Caldwell?
That was Sylvia's maiden name, the name she'd gone back to after the divorce, the name she wore like a coat of arms. I held Yvonne's hand until she fell asleep. Then I went out into the hallway and called my brother. My brother Warren is 68 years old and spent 22 years as a county sheriff's deputy before his knees gave out. He is the quietest man I know, which sounds like a simple thing until you understand that his particular brand of quiet is the kind that makes people nervous. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't fill silence. He just waits with these steady gray eyes, and eventually the truth comes out of whoever he's looking at, because it gets uncomfortable not to say it. He picked up on the second ring. "Sylvia Caldwell," I said, "and her sister Roberta. I need you to listen." He listened. I talked for 6 minutes, standing in a hospital corridor with the overhead lights buzzing faintly and a cart of meal trays rolling past. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. "Is Yvonne willing to give a statement?" he said. "Yes." "Good. Don't let Elliot go near his mother's house. Don't let him call her. Don't let him do anything until I get there." He was at the hospital in 40 minutes. Warren sat with Yvonne for a long time with a notepad and his careful, unhurried questions, and Elliot sat in the waiting room, and I sat with him because I knew if I left him alone he would call his mother and say things that would complicate everything. My son is a good man. Good men sometimes want to handle things the wrong way. While Warren was still with Yvonne, I slipped out to the parking lot and called my son-in-law, my daughter Patrice's husband, who is a property attorney. I told him about the land trust and the documents Sylvia had claimed to have. He was quiet for a moment. "She's bluffing," he said. "Joint accounts require both signatures for any legal action, and an accusation with no filing is just noise. But here's the thing, if she's been telling people these things, making accusations out loud, that opens her up to defamation. Depending on who she's told." "Get me everything you can," I said. "Give me until morning," he said. "I have known Sylvia for 7 years, and I never liked her, and I always felt guilty about it. She was Elliot's mother." I told myself I was being too harsh, that people can be difficult without being dangerous, that families are complicated, and she had her own grief about the divorce and her own fears about losing her son. I gave her benefit of the doubt I should have spent on Yvonne instead. There had been comments over the years, little ones, the kind you can't quite call out directly, because they always come with a smile. When Yvonne cooked a dish at Christmas, Sylvia would say, "Oh, how interesting." When Yvonne was promoted at her clinic, Sylvia had asked Elliot privately whether he was sure Yvonne wasn't working too many hours, whether that was really the right choice with a baby coming. When Yvonne had a small pregnancy complication in the first trimester and was put on limited activity for 2 weeks, Sylvia had told Elliot, not Yvonne Elliot, that maybe it was a sign. A sign of what? Sylvia had not said. She hadn't needed to, but I had let it go, all of it, every single time. I sat in that waiting room and I made myself look at that clearly, the way you look at something you've been putting off. I had let it go because confronting it would have been uncomfortable, and because I told myself Yvonne was strong and she was handling it, and because I didn't want to make things harder for Elliot. I had prioritized the piece of the table over the safety of the person sitting at it. I would not do that again. Warren came out of Yvonne's room after 2 hours. His notepad was full. He sat down next to me and Elliot, and he spoke quietly and clearly the way he always does. "She has enough for an assault charge, possibly more, depending on what the DA decides to do with the endangerment angle, leaving a pregnant woman in those conditions on a public road. That's not nothing." He looked at Elliot steadily. "Your mother and your aunt are going to be questioned. Tonight, if I can arrange it." I need you to stay out of it." Elliot nodded. His hands were clasped between his knees. "The property documents she mentioned," Warren continued, glancing at me. "Has anyone looked at the land trust lately? I'm having someone look at it now," I said. Warren nodded slowly. "Because if she's been making moves on that trust without authorization, that's a separate conversation." Elliot looked up. "What kind of moves?" Warren just looked at him, that steady, waiting look. "Tell me," Elliot said. Warren set his notepad on the table between us. On one page, he'd written two names that Yvonne had mentioned, two people Sylvia had supposedly shown the financial documents to, people from their church, people whose opinion Elliot cared about. He'd also written an address, a name I didn't recognize, a notary in the next county. "Does your mother know any notaries in Grafton County?" Warren asked. Elliot stared at the page. "That's Roberta's side of the county," he said slowly. "Roberta's ex-husband had a notary business out there. He retired." Warren picked up his notepad and stood up. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "The call from my son-in-law came at 7 the next morning. I was at the hospital. I hadn't gone home. I'd sent Elliot home around midnight. He needed sleep more than he needed to sit in a plastic chair, and I'd stayed with Yvonne's, sleeping upright in the chair next to her bed, waking whenever she moved." The call was brief. What he'd found was not simple, and I'm going to try to explain it plainly. Elliot's grandfather had set up the land trust 20 years ago. The terms were standard. The property could only be sold if 3/4 of the named heirs agreed in writing, with signatures notarized and filed with the county. Elliot, as the eldest grandchild, held a weighted vote, effectively a veto. He had exercised that veto 18 months ago when Sylvia had first proposed the sale. What my son-in-law found when he pulled the county filings was a document submitted 8 weeks ago. A consent form with Elliot's signature, except Elliot had not signed any consent form. My son-in-law had pulled the notarization. The notary seal was from a business in Grafton County, a retired notary. Roberta's ex-husband's business. I sat with that for a long moment in the quiet of Yvonne's hospital room, listening to her breathe. Then I called Warren. I will not pretend the next 2 weeks were clean or simple. They weren't. Legal things never are. There were depositions and there were attorneys, and there were days when Elliot came home looking like he'd been wrung out and hung up to dry. There were things he learned about his mother that he is still processing, things I don't think a grown child ever fully makes peace with, the distance between who you believed a person was and who they turned out to be. Sylvia and Roberta were both charged, Sylvia with assault and criminal endangerment, Roberta with document fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. The notary, who had apparently done this kind of favor before, was included in the filing. The land trust was frozen pending review, which meant nobody was selling anything for the foreseeable future. Yvonne came home from the hospital after 3 days. I was there when Elliot brought her home, and I stayed for a week, sleeping in the guest room, cooking, answering the door, keeping things quiet so she could rest. Her ribs made it hard to sleep comfortably, and she had to be careful about how she moved. And some mornings I could hear her in the bathroom crying quietly when she thought no one would hear. I didn't knock on the door those mornings. I just made sure the tea was ready when she came out. She and I had a lot of quiet mornings together that week. One morning, sitting at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her mug, she said, "I kept thinking, on that road, I kept thinking about the baby. Just what does this baby come into? What kind of family?" I thought about that for a moment before I answered. "The kind that came for you," I said. "That's the kind." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded and looked back out the window. "The baby came on a Sunday in January at 6:42 in the morning during a light snow. I was in the waiting room when Elliot came out, and I can tell him now that the look on his face when he walked through that door is one I will keep for the rest of my life. He looked like a man who had just understood something enormous and was not yet sure his body was big enough to hold it. "It's a girl," he said. "Mom, she's perfect." I held my granddaughter for the first time at 8 a.m. on a January morning, wrapped in a yellow blanket, her face scrunched up and serious as though she was already thinking hard thoughts. She had Yvonne's nose and Elliot's ears, and this particular way of making a fist that reminded me suddenly, sharply, of her great-grandfather, of Elliot's father, of a man I had loved for 31 years who had left too soon. "Hello," I said softly to her small, serious face. "We have been waiting for you." Yvonne, watching from the bed, smiled, the first real full smile I had seen from her since September. She named the baby June. No, I'm sorry, that was someone else's story. She named her Willa Caldwell. Except Elliot, when he filled out the birth certificate, quietly used his father's surname, his real name, the name he was born with before his mother had gone back to hers. It was a small thing. It was everything. Sylvia's case went to trial the following spring. I was in the courtroom for 2 of the days, sitting a few rows back, watching. Sylvia sat very straight in her chair, and her attorney was good, and she cried at certain moments with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about when to cry. But Yvonne's testimony was clear and detailed and calm, and the emergency room photographs were what they were, and Warren had done thorough work, and in the end the jury took 4 hours. Roberta pled out before it got to trial. I don't take pleasure in that. I want to be honest about that. Sylvia was Elliot's mother. She is Willa's grandmother in the technical sense, the biological sense, the sense that cannot be altered. She will be a name in a story Willa is told someday, carefully, at the right age, in the right way. What she will not be is a presence in Willa's life. That was not my decision to make. It was Elliot's and Yvonne's. And they made it together quietly without drama. Some doors, once you see clearly what's on the side, you simply stop opening. Last Thanksgiving, Warren drove up from Roanoke, and my daughter Patrice and her husband came with the kids, and Yvonne's sister flew in from Phoenix, and we ate too much, and the kids ran through the house, and Willa, 10 months old by then, opinionated and loud, and already trying to pull herself up on everything, got sweet potato puree in Warren's beard, which he did not notice for an embarrassingly long time. At some point in the evening, I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes, and I looked through the pass-through into the living room where Elliot was sitting on the floor with Willa in his lap, both of them very serious, examining a wooden spoon together as though it might contain important information. I stood there for a moment and just watched. There is a particular kind of gratitude that doesn't have a clean name, the kind that comes not when things go right, but when things go right after they went terribly wrong. When you come out the other side of something and you can stand in your own kitchen in November and hear laughter in the next room. It sits differently in your chest than ordinary happiness. Heavier, maybe. More earned. I finished the dishes and dried my hands and went back in to be with my family. Willa looked up from the wooden spoon when I came in and broke into a grin so wide and sudden it was like a lamp turning on, and I thought, there it is. That's what we fought for. Right there. That's what we will always fight for.